welcome to Great Loop Radio, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo, the director of AGLCA. Today we're continuing our monthly Story of Our Great Loop series, and today we're going to be talking to the Gilpins. Hal and Wendy are gold loopers who completed the loop aboard their Grand Banks 42, and they'll be sharing all of those details with us. But before we jump into that, I do want to take a moment to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Curtis Stokes and Associates, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. So officially, I'd like to welcome Hal and Wendy to the Great Loop Radio podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
No problem.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here, and it was fun seeing you out there when you were doing the loop. But for those who didn't have that opportunity, let's start with who you are, what your boating experience was before the loop.
Okay. Well, Wendy and Hal Gilpin, as you said, just prior to the loop, we had, for all of our lives, we had basically been in retail. But the last 10 years, we were the owners of a bed and breakfast. So just prior to the loop, we owned that bed and breakfast for about 10 years. We sold the bed and breakfast actually just prior to the pandemic, and found ourselves living on our boat and made plans to start the loop. We figured we're on the boat, we may as well, head south.
Mm-hmm.
We had bought the boat about a year before we sold the business, and or a year and a half. And so it gave us, we had two summers in the Great Lakes to get used to the boat. And to be honest, it's a 42-foot Grand Banks, and it's the first boat we've owned. Mm-hmm. So it was fun,
Mm-hmm.
Challenging and fun. We had boated with our other friends for about 10 or 15 years on their boat, so I had experience through that. But after we sold the business, we really didn't know where we wanted to retire or live, and we thought we'd like to live on the boat for a while, which is why we started. And so we went onto the boat in April of 2019 and stayed on it then for 18 months straight. As we did the loop and spent the summer. We spent the summer in the Great Lakes, and then in the fall of 2020, we started the loop.
2020.
Yeah.
Or 2021. Yeah.
Right.
All the years blur together.
Yeah.
They really do. And you did, as you said, you got to spend more than one summer on the Great Lakes, which is really kind of phenomenal. So let's talk a little bit about kind of how you went about this. You hadn't personally owned a boat before, so with a 42-footer, yes, you decided to spend some time getting used to her first.
Yep.
So where did you keep her during that time, and where did you do your cruising?
We are berthed up in Racine, Wisconsin at Reef Point Marina. That's our home port. And so what we did is we did actually, during the summer, we took, especially the summer prior, we took 2 weeks and we went across the lake, and we went up to Mackinac City and St. Ignace, and down the Michigan side to Frankfurt. So we did about an 800-mile trip in about 15, 20 days with our traveling buddies, and just to get used to the boat, used to the nuances of it, and things. Found out quite a few things. Found out I needed brand new batteries because they all went dead on me during the trip.
Yep.
And things like that. So it was a good learning experience, and getting used to it, and just learning how to operate it and run it. So.
Yeah, it's such a great experience for, and we recommend it for loopers that even if you've had a boat before, if this is the first, if you're buying a boat for the Great Loop, it's so good to gain some experience aboard that boat first, and learn how it handles, learn what you're going to do during docking, find those problems, as you mentioned, the batteries. And I've had some loopers who tell me that they're so thankful they did that and had a consistent mechanic to work on their boat while they were kind of in that trial phase, so that if something went wrong, they had somebody they knew and trusted, but then somebody they could rely on after they did leave on the loop and were having, a small problem somewhere far away. There was somebody who knew the boat and that they trusted, that they could call and get some feedback, even if they didn't end up finding a local mechanic.
Yeah,
so I'm glad that worked out.
It's nice to have somebody that knows your boat. And we had a mechanic that worked on ours for 2 years, just making sure that everything was ready to go. You know, so that, like you say, if something went wrong, we at least would have been able to call back and touch base and give that information to whoever, you know, had to work on the boat. So
Right.
it was nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we
Well,
were
so
fortunate.
go ahead, Hal.
I said we were fortunate because we didn't have any real problems on the loop with
Mhm.
the motor. It
The
ran
engine,
perfectly.
nothing.
The only issue we had was as we were heading up the Hudson, we thought we had a bad inverter, but we went to find out that it was the place we were staying at was putting out too much voltage, and it was actually the voltage regulator in the inverter that shut it off. So we
Ah.
thought we were going without one for a while until we got to Brewerton,
Mhm.
and we had them check it out. And that's actually where we bought the boat, in Brewerton, New York. And so they were familiar with it, and they diagnosed it, and they said, no, everything's running fine. It's just it shut off because of a safety concern. And so that was it. That was the only problem we had in the entire loop.
Wow, that's fabulous.
Yeah.
So you mentioned you're home ported in Racine at Reef Point. That is an AGLCA sponsor, so we thank them for that. And we've got a few in Brewerton. So where did you buy the boat and where did you take it that time?
We were in Winter Harbor. We bought it in
Yep.
Winter Harbor.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Another
And
AGLCA
then-
sponsor. So thanks for that.
Yes.
Yep.
And
It was a great marina. They're both great marinas.
yeah,
actually.
they really
Mhm.
are. They
Yeah.
really are. And we purchased the boat well, we looked at it in an August time period. We purchased it in April, and then we left the boat in Brewerton from April until August because we were still running the B&B at the time.
Mhm.
And then I flew out there. I hired a captain who helped me with the boat, and we brought it back to Racine. And we actually did that trip in 11 days.
Right.
So
Wow.
yeah,
Quick trip.
1,100 miles. It
Wow.
was. We went hard and long days, but I
Mhm.
learned a lot on it then. And so then we brought it back. We had it in Racine for the rest of that summer and then the following summer
Right.
before we left the loop.
Yeah. So we've been talking about, where you got the boat and how you cruised on her for a summer before starting. We really haven't talked about what kind of boat it is. I think I mentioned in the intro that it was a Grand Banks 42. Is that correct though?
Yes.
Yep. It's a
Okay.
42 Grand Banks 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
it's a classic, the 42
Mhm.
Classic. It's a single engine, which is quite unusual for Grand Banks. Most of
Okay.
them are dual engines, and I really prefer a single engine, and I wanted one. It has a bow and a stern thruster, so it's quite maneuverable,
Mhm.
and easy because the boat I was familiar with was a Nordic Tug, and they are single engines. And so
Mhm.
I felt more comfortable, and I felt I could control it better with the single engine than with the dual.
Mhm.
I wasn't familiar with the controls and how those work and everything, so it worked out perfectly. But it has two staterooms, the salon, two heads in it. It has a fly bridge. We actually, when we lower our mast and our bimini down and everything, we were able to do the western portion of the Erie Canal because we could get under the fixed bridges,
Gotcha.
and we did that. So.
Mhm.
And this was during probably one of the summers that the Canadian border was closed for most of the summer, wasn't it?
No, they were open.
They were
Okay.
open, but it was well, it was last summer, and it was the summer that there were some challenges in
Yeah.
Canada with
Yeah.
Mhm.
many of the things being closed. So
Right.
we debated, and then we finally decided we were just going to do the Erie Canal, and absolutely loved it. I mean, I don't think you can do anything wrong on any of the trips that you choose. You take them for a different reason, and you enjoy them for what they have to offer. So the Erie Canal, we were lucky we could get under those bridges.
Mhm.
It was not crowded. It was beautiful.
The small town, if you can go past the Oswego Canal, if you can get past that and continue on the Erie, the small towns there are just wonderful. They are absolutely phenomenal, and friendly, and the marina, it's not even marina. You just pull up to the walls. It's almost like they barely even charge anything for docking there and stuff,
Yeah.
or it's on the honor system and everything. And the people are so friendly and stuff. It's a lot of fun. It really is on the Erie. We didn't do it the first year when we bought the boat because I didn't have the paperwork to go through Canada, so we had to basically come through the Erie Canal, and I really
Right.
enjoyed it, and that's why we also did it again the second time because We debated about Canada, but we felt, no, I think we'll just stay through the Erie. And I'm kind of glad we'd made that decision, especially when that one railway bridge broke down and couldn't handle us.
Yeah, as you said, there's kind of no wrong choice there, and more loopers probably did the Western Erie in the last 3 seasons or so than previously because of all the COVID issues and the Canadian border being closed. And people have really raved about it. So I'm glad that, the Western Erie got its chance to kind of show off a little bit.
Yes.
And yes, of course, the railroad bridge Hal is talking about, or the Marine Railway
Right.
on the Trent Severn. There were a few mechanical issues with a few of the locks, a few of the
Right.
historic locks there last year.
Yeah, they gave you plenty of no. I'm honestly, I felt like their communication about that situation was so good. We still could have done it, but
Mhm.
and we could only do it one way or the other. So
Yeah.
and it was like you say, it was the people on the Erie Canal could not have been nicer.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, so tell us what it was about the Grand Banks 42 Classic that made that the right choice for your loop. We know that you said it was single engine, which is what you were looking at. Anything about the design or the cruising speed, or what else kind of attracted you to that particular boat?
The cruising speed is one. I mean, we don't go fast. We did the 6,000 miles at 8 miles an hour, basically.
Mhm.
And I like the styling. I like the lines of it. Really and truly, because we had looked at boats for quite a few years, and I just wasn't into the sleeker ones. And I like the trawler because I like the space it provides you, and it really felt like a home.
Mhm.
It was comfortable. I could stand up in every spot of it. I didn't have to bend over on anything. It was just a very comfortable boat and felt like home.
Yeah,
Mhm.
we like the galley being above so that you can see out, um, which is really nice to me because it just, again, it felt open. And then the main stateroom is down, obviously down below, and has a queen size bed and provides you with plenty, again, like Hal says, plenty of space to move around. You don't, people that come onto the boat are always so amazed at how much room this boat, as well as many others, have. They're always, I think they're thinking that they're going to walk into this little tight little area, and it's really not. They're very open, very welcoming. Like I say, the galley being up above, that was a big one for us.
Yeah.
And it's economical to run and operate. So that's the other thing that we were looking at. And that's another reason I kind of shied away from a dual engine, because dual engines is dual maintenance.
Well, and with fuel prices where they have, I guess you were probably a little bit. Well, no,
Oh no, we hit them.
definitely did hit
We hit them.
you hit the $6
Oh yeah.
and up a gallon that we hit too. So
Oh yeah.
those were the times that I was like, we are on the wrong boat.
Yeah, we hit it, but you know what? It was what it was, and we just kept saying, hey, if we were home and we were using our two cars and driving around every day, we would have been spending a whole lot of money on gas at the same time. So you just had to take it for what it was, and you just had to enjoy it and say, okay, it's a lot of people I know have talked about stopping because of the prices, and it was like, if we stop, then what's going to be the next year's issue? And so yeah, the fuel wasn't great, but it was really good to start with, and it did start to come down as we went further north. So it wasn't bad.
Right. So you mentioned in your pre-interview that the draft for the Grand Banks 42 Classic is about 4.5 feet. So, and you mentioned you wouldn't have wanted anything that draws more than that. So did you run into any issues? What's the reason for not wanting anything that draws more than that, other than, obviously fear of running aground, but, tell us a little bit what you experienced at 4.5 feet.
Well, at 4.5 feet, I still ran aground 3 times. Okay, but one of those times was in the dinghy, so you can't.
So we don't really count
that doesn't count.
but
and we were able to get out the other 2 times. We didn't have to get towed.
Yep.
We were in low water. We came down the Illinois River during the summer of low water, as many people did. So a lot of times it was a lot of communication back and forth with the other boaters. Obviously, you've got your charts and you've got everything else available to you. You've got everything. but there's nothing like talking to somebody else that's ahead of you by a day or so, just to hear about, well, yeah, you're 4.5, we got in, we're fine. No, don't go there type
Yeah.
of thing. So
Right.
that 4.5 foot is, it's sort of like, I feel like it was like the magic number. It was
Hmm.
like, 4.5, you could make it. Anything over 4.5, you were just making, I think, some slightly different decisions.
Hmm.
No,
So,
I felt comfortable with it. I mean, that was, I think, probably one of the biggest surprising things, especially as it came up the East Coast, is on the ICW, I was expecting a dredge channel all the way, all the way. No issues, 6 feet of water minimum or something like that. And I found parts of it to be very challenging. And that was probably the biggest issue I had is I really don't want to deal with shallow water, skinny water again today.
Right.
Looking at the at aqua maps and all of those, it's showing bright red, it's showing 4 feet. I just don't want to drag bottom. And so there were actually a couple times where we added 10 extra miles and we just went out into the Atlantic.
Hmm.
And because the Atlantic was going to be calm that day, and we went out there and I just, popped it up to 9 miles an hour and put it on cruise control and put my feet up, and it was great.
Hmm.
Just watched out that way rather than
Yeah.
having to stare at the monitor the entire time.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons we did not do the Dismal Swamp, because I wouldn't have seen anything, because I would have been too busy just staring at the monitor the entire time,
yeah.
Yeah.
trying not
Yep.
to run aground. And that to me was not fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So the rule was we're supposed to have fun, and
yeah,
that's how we did it. So,
yeah,
Absolutely. Yep. And
yeah.
that's also why, we don't draw quite as much as your boat does. But we have our own parameters too, where it's supposed to be
right.
fun. And if the wind is above something else, a specific
Yep.
Yep.
forecast, we don't go because it's not fun. So
That was kind of our rule. If we had to talk about the weather more than 15 minutes in the morning, we didn't
mhm.
go.
Yeah,
We
that's
stayed
a good
put.
rule actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep, that
So
was the rule. You have to have fun. That was,
yeah.
otherwise to us there wasn't any reason to be on, the journey. So
yeah,
And we ran
absolutely.
into people who were like, they were on a schedule, and that's the worst thing you can do. You can have a plan, but God, don't be on that schedule,
Yep.
because all of a sudden we ran into one couple. They had to be in New York to catch a flight because they were going on a vacation in Ireland, and they were in Cape May. And it's like, so he went out in some of the crappiest weather. And I'm thinking, why don't you just rent a car and leave it here? It's only a
Yeah.
150-mile drive to New York.
Right.
It's probably safer to take the car than it was the boat.
Yeah.
So so you really have to just kind of watch it. But yeah, we just had a plan, and we allowed a lot of give and take in the plan, and we got where we wanted to be on specific dates that we wanted to be there. That were like when we wanted to be in Annapolis, we planned it, or Washington D.C. We planned that in Key West, and we made the date. But sure enough, all the things in between getting there changed a lot. So
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a quick break and I'll play a message from one of our sponsors. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about, kind of your cruising preferences, how long the days were, how many miles per day was typically your average, anchorages versus marinas, that kind of thing.
sure.
And we'll cover that as soon as we come back. So we'll be back in a
Okay.
moment.
Okay.
Prop Talk is an Annapolis-based company founded in the summer of 2005 by active Chesapeake Bay boaters. The company produces Prop Talk Magazine, a monthly newsprint magazine focused on Chesapeake Bay powerboating and the lifestyle surrounding boating on the bay. Every issue of Prop Talk is distributed at more than 850 carefully chosen and closely monitored locations throughout the Mid-Atlantic. Prop Talk's coverage goes deep rather than wide, and the magazine celebrates the people, places, boats, personalities, and events that make the Chesapeake one of the world's premier boating grounds. Thanks for reading and supporting the Chesapeake Bay's boating magazine. We're back on Great Loop Radio today. My guests are Hal and Wendy, and they completed the loop last year in a Grand Banks 42 Classic, and they are telling us the story of their Great Loop adventure. So where we left off, we wanted to hear a little bit more about, what I'd call your cruising preferences, what your average distance per day. We talked a little bit about your speed,
mhm.
anchorages versus marinas. How do you prefer to do this?
We tried not to go over 50 miles a day. There were some days that had to have, we went maybe 65 or so. But we like to leave early, so we'd leave, 7, 8 in the morning, and we'd always try and be in port by 3 in the afternoon at the latest. So that we could just relax and things like that. We really found, in the coming down the rivers and system and stuff, you have to anchor. It's not our forte, and I will be honest with you on that. It just is not our forte, and I like to sleep at night, and I didn't sleep well at night when we anchored out, and things like that. And we heard some of the horror stories. We had friends who were the ones that got stuck over by Cape Girardeau, and one boat broke loose and broke off another anchor on another boat, and they both wound up out in the middle of the Mississippi with barges coming in both directions and things like that. And so really, really and truly, when we left Key West, we did marinas all the way up the coast, all the way back home. We did not anchor out once. And it didn't add that much to the expense of the trip, to be honest. Plus, we enjoyed all the small towns we were at. They were phenomenal. And so it was really a nice experience. And I just didn't want to have to deal with tides and wind and anchor dragging and all that stuff. So we just chose to take the other route and do marinas, and we're glad we did.
Yeah, but we've heard of other people, that did anchorages, and they absolutely love anchoring out.
Right.
Again, I think it's a preference. We just found we had some of the best marinas, honestly, as we went. We also had really good weather.
Yes.
The entire year. We had, our bad time was the time when I think the rendezvous was going on in Norfolk. And we ended up in Annapolis. And I think the people in Norfolk got stuck there for maybe a week. Well, we got stuck in Annapolis. Yes. And we got stuck in Annapolis. So as soon as we heard you guys were all leaving, we hightailed it out of Annapolis to, just to sort of stay ahead of the crowd that was coming behind us. But our weather honestly could not have been better. We, as Hal says, we would leave early in the morning. We tried to do, maybe we would do a day or two of one night stays. And then we would do maybe a 3-night stay. And then every 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, we would stay for a week in a place. Just especially towns that we wanted to really explore. So
we also found that because we stayed in Key West for the month of January.
Yeah.
And so then like February 4th or something, we were headed back north. Well, all of a sudden, before we knew it, we were getting ahead of the weather.
Yeah, so we slowed down.
And so we had to slow down. I mean, in hindsight, I'd have spent 2 months in Key West, and we still had plenty of time. But yeah, we had to slow down. So we spent, 7 days in St. Augustine. We did a side trip to New Bern, North Carolina or South Carolina, I can't remember.
North Carolina.
North Carolina. Okay, New Bern. We did a side trip to Washington, D.C. We did a side trip. We stayed 3.5 weeks in Annapolis. And so, and our side trips were a week long in each of those places too. So we did that, and that was refreshing, because then it was like, okay, I'm going to be here for a while. This is nice. I can just, I don't have to gear up and get in my head. Okay, I got to move again. And stuff like that. So that worked out well. But we really encouraged the side trips. Washington, D.C., we probably could have spent 2 weeks there, to be honest. And it was
easily.
We were at the Yacht Club Marina, which is right there. And it's phenomenal in walking distance within everything, although you walk a lot, but right there, it was great.
And the Capital Yacht Club actually became a sponsor in the past year.
And
it is a great location. It's a great place to tie up. You will be tied up there with some of our, nation's leaders. There literally are senators and congressmen who live there aboard boats at the Capital Yacht Club.
I think people forget. I mean, we heard and we've seen and heard a lot about the cost of doing things. And somebody said, you went to Washington, D.C. for a whole week. And first of all, we did not find the marina to be overly priced at all. And it was beautifully kept, and they couldn't have been more welcoming. And you felt incredibly safe. And everything else that you did other than eat in Washington, D.C. is free.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you know, if I go to a museum here in Chicago, it's $25.
Mhm.
You go to a museum in Washington, D.C. So you sort of have to weigh those things and you know, and say, okay, yeah, maybe I'm going to spend a little bit more time coming up the Potomac and spend a little more fuel. But gosh, the offset is you just can't miss. That's the whole thing.
We
Yeah.
also looked at it too. I mean, when we stayed in New York over a week,
Mhm.
almost an entire week, and we were at the one right across it was in New Jersey, right
Yep.
next
Liberty
to
Landing.
Liberty
Yeah.
Landing. Thank you.
Yeah, and they
And
are also an
people,
AGLCA sponsor. So thank you for
They
stopping at all
are.
these
yeah,
AGLCA sponsor
We
marinas.
tried to
We
do
love
that.
yeah,
it.
and
That
people
was
were
how we
like,
looked.
yeah,
So
but people were like, you stayed there a whole week? What about the expense? I'm like, try and get a hotel room in New York for under $200 a day. You know,
Yeah,
it's
very
not gonna
true.
happen.
yeah,
So you have to put it in perspective. And that was a great spot to launch out of, you know, and just you zip across the river and you're right downtown Manhattan.
Mhm.
And then when we went to, you know, we went further up and we went up to Croton on the Hudson. And we actually took the train back into New York for a
Mhm.
day, and saw Upper Manhattan, you know,
Yeah.
from that point and stuff. So yeah, it all worked out great. But
Yeah.
yeah, we were marina people mostly.
So overall, I think you said it took you about a year.
50 weeks.
50 weeks.
But actual cruising days in those 50 weeks was 122.
Yes.
It's so interesting because regardless of the speed of the boat, we ask lots of go loopers these preferences, and regardless of how fast they choose to go, it almost always works out to an average of 50 or so miles a day, and it almost
Yeah.
always works out to around 125 days, roughly a year, and roughly
Right.
traveling on average 1 out of every 3 days. So we get
Yeah.
asked those questions so much as well. How long are you actually cruising? And it's just so common that regardless of whether you stayed somewhere 3.5 weeks or stayed somewhere, you know, hardly at all,
Right.
it just always seems to work out to so close
Yeah.
to those same numbers. So
Yeah. Yeah.
really
Yeah.
fascinating to me. But we actually are
I think,
starting. Oh, go ahead, Hal.
I was going to say, one of the other cool things about the trip was because of the speed of our boat, dolphins love it. And we had every day that we cruised from the time we got into Mobile Bay until we got to New York Harbor, we had dolphins beside our boat, and it never got old, ever.
That is
It was,
fabulous. And it does never
yeah.
get old. And we see them at home in Charleston. We have not seen them a ton on the loop. And I've been blaming it on just the sound of our engines. They're two, more
Uh-huh.
powerful dual
Yeah.
engine. I haven't really
Yeah.
thought
Yeah.
about the speed. We should go a
It's
little
it's it's
slower
the
and
speed.
see if
It's
it
the speed.
because our typical cruising speed is about 8 to 10 knots, but we're usually closer to that 10 knots end of that spectrum. So
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
we leave here, I'm gonna have to say let's do 8, maybe 7. Let's see how
Yep.
that goes,
See what
Yep.
happens.
because it is magical and it does never get old. So
It
Right.
is. It's a lot of fun.
yeah, before we run out of time, because we try to keep it pretty close to 30
Okay.
minutes.
Okay.
Just tell us a little bit, what were a couple of the highlights of your trip?
That one's it. Everybody has asked us that, and that's very tough to
It is
answer.
tough.
It
It's
is.
very tough. I think the whole trip was phenomenal.
Mhm.
Just the places you saw, the other boaters that we met. We now have, other friends that that we are in contact with, and it's where you met that group that came down the river, and then the moment you hit Mobile Bay, you all kind of split up and do your own
Mhm.
thing, and then all of a sudden on the West Coast or the East Coast, you start meeting up with people again, or especially back in the Great Lakes.
Mhm.
And I think it's a unique experience. But to pick one thing, I can't do it.
Yeah.
There were so many, but one day we pulled into Beaufort.
Mhm.
Was it Beaufort? Yeah,
Yeah,
it was
Beaufort.
Beaufort.
South Carolina?
Yep.
Yeah, we pulled into Beaufort, and as we pulled in, it was a Sunday, and there was a concert being done by the Marine Corps and the Army. They had joined together. They were doing the bands were doing a concert, and as
Yeah.
we pulled in, they were playing. Were they playing the Stars?
The Star
The
Spangled
Star-Spangled
Banner.
Banner.
And our
Mhm.
boat's named Patriot.
As we
Right.
pulled in, it was just so
Just
cool
cool.
because everybody's looking, and everybody's always looking at your boat.
Yeah.
You
Mhm.
know, first of all, they're looking and you just hope that you don't, crash into the dock or anything
There's that.
stupid. So that's the first thing. But just to, come in that way, or in Washington, D.C. and being able to see the Washington Monument,
Yeah.
like literally right in front of you for a week.
Yeah.
I think it's getting to see the United States from a different perspective.
Right.
Absolutely.
Traveling down the river by Shenandoah and those things are in the South where it's the Civil War, and then all of a sudden you're into the American history and the American Revolution and that history, and it just changes. And it's really phenomenal to know that, and at one point you crossed where Washington crossed the Delaware. So,
or come into New York City and know that your ancestors came into New York the same way that you were coming in, going,
going
and
through
then,
Ellis Island.
And as Hal said, the people, but I have to tell you, the people in the towns that we were in, they could not have been more welcoming.
Yeah.
They incredible. I mean, and they were also interested in what you were doing and why you were doing it. And again, I'll repeat. I mean, some people say that they've had issues, like maybe when they've docked and things. We did not. We really just didn't. And if you're alert like you would be at home when you're in the city or whatever, we just didn't have issues. And I think, the towns that we went to, the people were great. The camaraderie between the loopers and, quite honestly, some non-loopers that obviously you ran into as you went, it was phenomenal. And it was, it's a whole different network of people, I think.
We were not afraid or too proud to ask for help.
Yeah.
Docking or anything like that.
We asked
that's good advice. I've had multiple loopers who have finished the trip use this same phrase, that this restored their faith in humanity. Because of the other loopers, but also because of the people in the towns. You just meet so many people willing to help, or just people who are curious about what you're doing, or people who want to tell you about their town, that you don't see that in everyday life anymore.
Right.
And it's kind of a return to kind of that small town lifestyle where people look out for each other. And it's just one of the things that makes the trip just such an amazing journey.
And like you said, the sponsored marinas, the marinas that were sponsors, they were fantastic. I mean,
I'm glad to hear that.
I mean, really, like you'd call in, we made our appointments, we made reservations probably a little bit earlier than a lot of other people did. Like sometimes people would make reservations on the same day. We tended not to do that. So we would make our reservations maybe a couple days out. The communication back and forth really was fantastic. Wonderful. They'd let you know, do you need help when you dock? When you dock, they would really give you the real quick lowdown of what you could expect when you walked into their town. So I would highly recommend using those. If you can find a marina that's a sponsor that's available, go for it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That means a lot to us and to our sponsors. So any final advice before we wrap up for those who maybe are contemplating following in your footsteps? I'm sorry. I think we lost the audio for just a second there, Hal. Just start that one again. There we go.
I said the biggest thing is really and truly have a plan, but not a schedule. The schedule is what gets you in trouble, and right off the bat. So just have a plan and enjoy it, and just have a lot of fun with it. We did.
And reach out to the harbor hosts that are out there.
Yeah, great point.
They're another resource. I think that sometimes you forget, or you think that you're going to infringe on their time, and really you're not. If they don't want to be a harbor host, they're not going to be a harbor host.
Exactly.
So that was the other thing, was like Hal says, you can't be afraid to ask for help.
I think probably the other thing that we didn't even mention is Nebo, and the instant messaging that you can do on Nebo. You're getting real-time information on that. And we would message people if we were going to stay someplace, or like when we were on the river system, and how is this anchorage, or things like that. And you'd get information back because you saw that boat. And then later on, you might meet up with them. And then like, okay, I know who you are now, and things like that. But really and truly, that was a great tool to use.
Yeah. And for anyone who's listening and not familiar with Nebo, it is an app. It's spelled Nebo, Nebo. It's a third-party app that AGLCA has adopted as its way for members to find one another on the water. It does some other really cool things besides that, but in this regard, that what Hal is talking about, it is extremely useful because it is truly real time. You can see where other loopers are, and we've used it, approaching some of the free walls on the Erie Canal a little bit late in the day, knowing there were a lot of boats out there. We would message somebody who was already there and say, hey, is there still room, or should we come out, should we go to Anchorage? Really helpful. So just wanted to add that in case anyone was unfamiliar with it, and because it is a really good piece of advice. So thank you for sharing that too. You both have given us kind of a lot of gems to think about, and I think it'll be really useful for others who are considering the Great Loop. So thank you for that. We really appreciate you being with us.
Well,
No problem. Thank you. Thank you for asking.
My pleasure. And for everyone who has listened today, we will be back next week with another episode of the Great Loop Radio podcast. Until then, safe cruising.